If you've ever been to one of those old flea markets, you know how weirdly fascinating they can be. Rows and rows of dusty antiques, mismatched furniture, and boxes of knick-knacks that look like they belong in a museum or a trash heap. That's where I was last Saturday, wandering aimlessly, hoping to find something cool to bring home. It wasn't like I needed anything, I was just killing time. But there's something about those places that draws you in. Like every random object has a story waiting to be told. I was halfway through the market when I saw it. A small table, tucked away in the back, covered with faded books, rusted tools, and random odds and ends. Sitting right in the center was this key. It wasn't like a regular house key or even one of those vintage skeleton keys people use for decoration. This was something else entirely. It was iron, heavy, with these intricate carvings etched into the handle, spirals and symbols that didn't make any sense to me. I picked it up, running my fingers over the grooves. It felt cold, heavier than it looked, like it had been waiting for someone to notice it. Interesting piece, isn't it? I turned to see the vendor, an old man with a gray beard and a weathered face. His voice was calm, but there was something about the way he was watching me that made my skin prickle. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound casual. "What's the story behind it?" He shrugged. "Found it in a box at an estate sale. Don't know much about it, but it's old. Probably handmade. You can have it for $10. Something about the way he said it felt off, like he wanted to get rid of it. $10, huh? I hesitated for a second. Deal. As he handed me the key, his grip lingered just a little too long. "Be careful with it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I brushed it off as flea market theatrics and went about my day. That night I tossed the key on my dresser and forgot about it. I was exhausted and all I wanted was to collapse into bed. That's when the dream started. I was standing in a long, dark hallway. The walls were lined with doors, wooden, metal, some cracked and splintered, others gleaming like they'd just been polished. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the only sound was this low, rhythmic thumping, like something heavy being dragged on the floor. I knew I shouldn't open any of the doors. I could feel it in my gut, this overwhelming sense of dread. But then I saw the key. It was in my hand, its cold weight anchoring me to the spot. Without thinking, I walked to the nearest door and slid the key into the lock. It turned smoothly, almost too smoothly, and I heard the soft click of the mechanism. When the door creaked open, there was nothing but darkness on the other side. No, not just darkness. Movement. Shadows swirling, shifting. Something alive just beyond the threshold. Then it reached for me. A hand, pale, thin, with fingers that looked impossibly long, shot out from the darkness. I stumbled back, heart pounding, as the hand clawed at the air, inches from my face. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. My room was silent, the faint glow of the streetlights spilling through the window. It took me a minute to calm down, to remind myself it was just a dream. But when I looked over at my dresser, the key wasn't there. It was on my bed. The key hadn't moved. That's what I told myself over and over again as I stared at it sitting on my bed. Maybe I grabbed it without thinking when I got up in the middle of the night. Or maybe I knocked it off the dresser. There had to be a logical explanation. I picked it up, feeling its weight in my hand again, the cool metal pressing against my palm. It still felt heavier than it should, like it wasn't just a piece of iron but something alive. I shoved it back into the top drawer of my dresser, slammed it shut, and decided to ignore it. But ignoring it wasn't going to be that easy. The dreams came back the next night, worse this time. The hallway was longer, darker. The doors weren't just sitting there. They were shaking, as if something on the other side was pounding on them, desperate to get out. The thumping sound was louder, echoing in my ears, and the air felt heavier, colder. I didn't want to open a door, but the key was in my hand again. I tried to throw it away, but my fingers wouldn't let go. I felt like I was being pulled toward one of the doors, my legs moving on their own. When I got close, I could hear whispers on the other side, low and unintelligible. The key slid into the lock on its own, and before I could stop myself, I turned it. The door creaked open, and this time I could see into the darkness. Shapes moved inside, indistinct figures, hunched and shuffling, their eyes glowing faintly. One of them turned its head toward me, and I swear it smiled. I woke up screaming. The key was on the nightstand. At this point, I couldn't chalk it up to coincidence anymore. Something was happening, something I couldn't explain, and it was starting to bleed into the real world. The next day, I noticed the first object. It was a doll, old and worn, sitting in the corner of my living room. I didn't own any dolls, let alone one like this. Its porcelain face was cracked and one of its eyes was missing. It stared at me from the corner, lifeless but somehow watching. I asked myself if I'd just forgotten about it. Maybe it had been in a box I hadn't unpacked yet, but I knew that wasn't true. I would have remembered something that creepy. I picked it up, intending to throw it out, but as soon as I touched it, the same cold feeling from the key washed over me. It was like the doll was part of the same thing. I set it on the coffee table and backed away. That night, the dream came again. More doors, more whispers, more shadows moving just beyond the light. But this time, the figure from the last door stepped closer. I could see its face now, sunken eyes, a jagged mouth that looked like it had been torn open. "You opened it," it rasped, "and now we're here." I bolted awake, gasping for air, my skin slick with sweat. My house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was just another nightmare. But when I got out of bed, I found another object waiting for me. This time, it was a small tin box, rusted and dented. I opened it carefully, my hands trembling. Inside was a photograph of a family, a man, a woman, and 2 young boys. The edges of the picture were burnt, and the faces of the parents were scratched out. I didn't know these people. The next few days were a blur. More objects started appearing. A broken pocket watch, a lace glove with stains I didn't want to think about, a bundle of letters written in shaky, almost illegible handwriting. They were scattered throughout my house, in places I knew I hadn't put them. And the dreams? They didn't stop. Every night I found myself back in the hallway, opening more doors. Every time I opened one, the thing inside got closer, its voice louder. I started to feel like I wasn't alone in my own home. I'd hear faint creaks in the floorboards when I was sitting on the couch, soft taps on the walls when I was trying to sleep. Shadows moved in the corners of my vision, disappearing when I turned my head. I tried to get rid of the key. I drove out to a park miles from my house and threw it into the lake. Watching it sink beneath the water gave me a fleeting sense of relief, like I was finally free of it. That relief vanished when I got home. The key was back, sitting on my kitchen counter, perfectly dry. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? The key was back, sitting on my counter like it had never left. I stared at it for hours, too afraid to touch it, too terrified to look away. By morning, I was running on adrenaline and bad coffee. I decided to leave the house, take a walk, clear my head. But no matter where I went, the thought of the key stayed with me, nagging at the edges of my mind like a song I couldn't forget. When I got back home, I noticed it immediately, the door. It wasn't a door I'd ever seen before. It didn't match the rest of my house. It was older, with peeling black paint and a brass handle shaped like a claw. It stood at the end of the hallway, where there had been nothing but blank wall before. I froze. My hands started to shake. This was the door from my dreams. The air around it was cold, colder than it had any right to be, and the faint sound of whispers seeped through the cracks. It was the same rhythm, the same murmurings that had haunted me in my sleep. I don't know why I moved closer. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to get as far away from that door as possible, but my legs didn't listen. The key was in my hand. I didn't even remember picking it up, but there it was, its cold weight pressing into my palm. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "This isn't happening, this isn't real." But it was. The whispers grew louder, rising to a crescendo that vibrated through the walls. My hand moved on its own, lifting the key to the lock. "Don't," I said, my voice trembling. "Please don't." The key turned. The lock clicked. The door swung open, and the cold hit me like a wave. It wasn't just cold, it was absence, like every ounce of warmth and light had been sucked out of the room beyond. I couldn't see anything at first, just darkness stretching out in every direction. But then they came. Figures, dozens of them, moving through the shadows. They were barely human, twisted skeletal forms with empty eyes and mouths that hung open as if screaming, though no sound came out. And then at the center of it all there was something else. It was taller than the others, its form more defined, more deliberate. Its face was obscured by a hood, but its presence was overwhelming. I could feel it watching me, its gaze piercing through the darkness like a blade. "You opened the door," it said. Its voice was low, reverberating through the air like a growl. "You let us out." I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. "I didn't mean to," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. It laughed, a deep, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. "Meaning has nothing to do with it. The key chose you, and now you are bound to it." The figures began to move closer, their forms becoming more solid with each step. I could see their faces now, hollow, broken things that looked more like masks than flesh. I tried to run, but the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me in the hallway with them. "Please," I begged. "What do you want from me?" The hooded figure stepped forward, its shadow stretching across the floor like it was alive. "You opened the door," it repeated, "and now you must carry the burden." The figures lunged at me, their hands cold and rough as they clawed at my skin. I screamed, thrashing against them, but there were too many. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I was back in my living room, gasping for air. The door was gone. The hallway was empty. But the key was still in my hand, its weight heavier than ever. I thought I was safe, but the whispers didn't go away. They were louder now, constant, a background hum that I couldn't escape. And then I saw it, a new door, standing in the corner of the room. The new door loomed in the corner of my living room, blacker than the one before. The edges seemed to pulse like it was alive, breathing in the stale air of my house. The whispers were louder now, not just coming from the door but echoing all around me, seeping into my bones. I couldn't run anymore. I gripped the key tighter, my fingers trembling as I stepped closer. The air grew colder with every step, freezing my breath in my throat. This door wasn't just another nightmare brought to life. It was something final, something that demanded to be faced. When I reached it, my heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The key moved in my hand as if it had a will of its own, sliding into the lock with eerie precision. The whispers stopped. For a brief, terrifying moment, everything was silent. Then, with a low groan, the door swung open. The darkness beyond wasn't just empty. It was consuming. It stretched infinitely, swallowing every hint of light. And there, in the center of it, was the hooded figure, waiting. "You've come," it said, its voice like the crackle of fire. "I knew you would." I stepped inside, my legs moving on their own. The door closed behind me with a finality that sent shivers down my spine. "I want this to end," I said, my voice shaking but firm. The figure tilted its head as though amused. "It will end," it said, "but not as you hope. The key has bound you to this place. You were chosen to open the doors, to set us free." "I didn't choose this," I shouted. "You didn't have to," it replied. "The choice was made long ago. Now you must fulfill your role." The figures from before began to emerge from the shadows, their twisted forms filling the space around me. Their eyes glowed faintly, their whispers returning, louder and more urgent than ever. I backed away, clutching the key like it could protect me. "No," I said, shaking my head. "I won't let this happen." The figure stepped closer, and for the first time, I saw its face, or what should have been its face. It was a void, an emptiness that pulled at me, threatening to drag me inside. "You cannot stop this," it said. "You are the key, and the key is you." The words hit me like a physical blow. Suddenly I understood. The key wasn't just an object. It was a part of me, a part I'd never asked for but couldn't escape. But I could still fight. I looked down at the key in my hand, its carvings glowing faintly now, and I realized what I had to do. I turned and ran, heading for the doors I'd opened before. The hallway stretched endlessly in front of me, lined with doors I recognized from my dreams. Each one was ajar, spilling cold air and shadows into the corridor. I started slamming them shut one by one, locking them with the key. The figures screamed as I forced them back inside, their hands clawing at the edges of the doors as I sealed them. But with every door I closed, I felt weaker, like the life was being drained out of me. The whispers grew angrier, louder, but I kept going. I couldn't stop now. Finally, I reached the last door, the one that had started it all. The hooded figure stood in front of it, its form towering over me. "You cannot win," it said, its voice a deep, guttural growl. I didn't respond. I lunged forward, shoving the key into the lock. The figure grabbed my arm, its touch burning like ice. But I twisted the key with all the strength I had left. The door slammed shut, and a deafening roar filled the hallway as the shadows were sucked back into the void. The figure's grip on me loosened, and for a moment I thought I'd won. But then the key in my hand began to glow brighter, hotter. "No," I whispered, realizing too late what was happening. The key pulled me toward the door, the force irresistible. I clawed at the floor, screaming, but it was no use. The last thing I saw was the hooded figure watching as I was dragged into the darkness. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't in my house anymore. I was back in the hallway, but it was empty now, silent and still. The doors were gone, and the key was nowhere to be seen. I looked down at my hands, at the faint glow pulsing beneath my skin. I understood. I was the key now. The cycle had to continue, and I was its new guardian. When When I first got the letter about the inheritance, I laughed out loud. It sounded like a joke. "Congratulations, Andrew Miller. You are now the proud heir to the caretaker position of Maple Hill Cemetery." I didn't even know I had an uncle who owned a cemetery. The lawyer assured me it was real. Apparently, my great-uncle Raymond had been the caretaker for decades and had left the job to me when he passed. The idea of leaving my life in Boston to move to some nowhere town in Vermont wasn't exactly appealing, but the timing couldn't have been worse, or maybe better, depending on how you looked at it. I'd just been let go from my job, rent was overdue, and I had no real prospects. So I packed up what little I had and drove north. The cemetery was something else. Maple Hill wasn't like the small, neatly arranged graveyards you'd find in a suburban town. This place was massive, sprawling over a hilltop surrounded by thick pine woods. The gate creaked as I pushed it open, the metal cold and heavy under my hand. The caretaker's cabin sat at the edge of the property, a squat wooden structure with peeling paint and a sagging porch. Inside, the air was stale, and the furniture looked like it hadn't been used in years. A single light bulb dangled from the ceiling, casting a dim glow over the room. The first night was quiet, too quiet. I wasn't used to this kind of silence. Back in the city, there was always noise, cars, people, the hum of streetlights. But here, nothing. I lay awake in the creaky bed, staring at the ceiling. Every little sound, the wind in the trees, the groan of the cabin's old beams, made my skin crawl. It wasn't fear exactly, just unease. The next day, I decided to explore the cemetery. It was bigger than I'd realized, rows upon rows of gravestones stretching farther than I could see. Most of the stones were weathered and crumbling, their inscriptions barely legible. But one stood out. It was in the center of the cemetery, taller and darker than the others. The stone was a deep black, polished to a shine that seemed to absorb the light around it. There were no flowers, no signs that anyone had visited it recently, but the ground around it was strangely untouched, as if the years hadn't dared to leave their mark. Curious, I stepped closer. Names were carved into the surface in neat rows. Elizabeth Carter, Brian Jensen, Laura Meyer. At first I thought it was a family plot, but there were no dates, just names. I didn't think much of it until the next morning, when I turned on the old radio in the cabin. The local news crackled through the static, and I froze when I heard the anchor's voice. There was a tragic car accident on Route 12 last night. 3 victims have been identified: Elizabeth Carter, Brian Jensen, and Laura Meyer. The coffee cup in my hand slipped and shattered on the floor. My mind raced. It had to be a coincidence, right? There was no way the names on that stone were connected to the news. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, as the sun set and the shadows grew long, I found myself drawn back to the stone. The names were different this time. Daniel Harris, Susan White, Mark Bell. I stared at the stone, my heart pounding. The air around me felt heavier, colder. I ran my fingers over the surface, the names smooth and freshly carved, as if they'd just been etched into the stone. A chill ran down my spine, and I turned to leave, my footsteps crunching against the gravel path. But as I walked away, I could have sworn I heard something. A faint whisper carried on the wind. When I got back to the cabin, I locked the door and shut the curtains. I told myself I wouldn't go back to that stone. Whatever was happening there, I didn't want any part of it. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the trees outside, felt amplified, like the world was holding its breath. I couldn't stop thinking about the stone, the names that had changed overnight, the accident that matched the first set. My brain kept cycling through possibilities. Coincidence, a sick joke, or maybe I was just imagining things. By morning, I'd convinced myself I needed answers. The first thing I did was check the names on the stone again. I hadn't been back since the previous night, and part of me hoped the names would be the same, that I'd been too tired to notice. They weren't. Rachel Coleman, Paul Abbott, Jacob Stein. The names were freshly carved, just like before. The polished black stone reflected my face as I stared at the list, the cold air biting at my skin. I reached out, running my fingers over the engravings, half expecting them to disappear under my touch. They didn't. I turned and walked quickly back to the cabin, trying to shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. Back inside, I flipped on the radio, the static crackling as I twisted the dial. The same news anchor's voice filled the room, her tone grim. This morning, 3 victims were pronounced dead after a house fire on Maple Drive. The victims have been identified as Rachel Coleman, Paul Abbott, and Jacob Stein. I froze. It wasn't possible. There was no way this was a coincidence. I spent the rest of the day combing through the cabin, looking for anything that might explain what was happening. If my uncle had been the caretaker for decades, surely he'd left some kind of records. After hours of searching, I found an old dusty trunk hidden beneath the bed. Inside were papers, photographs, and a leather-bound journal with Raymond Miller etched into the cover. My great-uncle's name. The journal was packed with notes, messy and erratic, like someone had been writing in a hurry. The entries started off mundane, weather updates, notes about grave maintenance, but as I flipped further, the tone shifted. The stone appeared after the storm. One entry read, "I didn't put it there, but now it's my problem." Another entry, written weeks later, was more frantic. "The names are always right. I thought I could stop it, but it doesn't work that way. The stone doesn't predict, it declares, and it's always watching." The handwriting grew sloppier as the entries went on, the words increasingly desperate. "I can't leave. It won't let me. I thought I was keeping people safe, but I think I'm the reason they die." My stomach turned as I closed the journal, my hands trembling. I sat back on the floor, staring at the old trunk, trying to make sense of it all. If the journal was right, then the stone wasn't just some strange coincidence or a marker for random deaths. It was connected to me now, just as it had been to my uncle. That night, the whisper started again. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound was too deliberate. Words, faint and indecipherable, floated through the air, coming from somewhere outside. Against my better judgment, I stepped out onto the porch. The cold hit me immediately, sharp and biting. The cemetery stretched out before me, the moonlight casting long shadows over the gravestones. "Shh, Andrew." "My name?" The whisper was faint but unmistakable. My chest tightened as I scanned the darkness, my eyes landing on the black stone in the distance. I wanted to go back inside, to lock the door and pretend I hadn't heard it, but my feet moved on their own, carrying me toward the stone. When I got close, I saw something new. At the bottom of the list of names, there was another one, freshly carved. Andrew Miller. I staggered back, my breath catching in my throat. The whispers grew louder, surrounding me, filling my head until I thought I might scream. "No," I said, shaking my head. "No, this can't be happening." The air around me felt heavier, colder, like it was pressing in from all sides. I turned and ran, my feet crunching against the gravel as I sprinted back to the cabin. Inside, I slammed the door shut and leaned against it, my chest heaving. The whispers were gone, replaced by an eerie silence. But I couldn't ignore what I'd seen. My name was on that stone. I couldn't stop staring at the journal. Its leather cover sat on the table in front of me, the pages stuffed with my great-uncle's frantic scrawls. The words, "The stone doesn't predict, it declares," ran through my head like a mantra, and now my name was carved into it. I couldn't pretend anymore. The stone wasn't just some eerie coincidence. It was connected to me, pulling strings, dictating the future. But the part that scared me the most was what my uncle had written about the deaths being my fault. Was I doing this somehow? I needed answers, and I was done waiting for them to come to me. Grabbing a flashlight, I stepped outside into the biting cold. The cemetery stretched out before me, silent except for the faint rustling of the wind through the trees. The black stone loomed in the distance, glinting under the moonlight like a predator's eye. As I approached, the whispers returned, faint but unmistakable. "Andrew?" I gritted my teeth and kept walking, my flashlight beam shaking as I pointed it ahead. The air felt heavier with every step, the ground beneath me soft and damp as if the earth itself was breathing. When I reached the stone, I felt it, like a pulse emanating from its surface, a low hum that vibrated through my chest. The names were still there, glowing faintly in the moonlight, and at the bottom, carved deeper than the rest, Andrew Miller. "What do you want from me?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, a cacophony of words I couldn't understand. My flashlight flickered, then died, plunging me into darkness. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, and then I saw it, shadows moving across the cemetery. At first I thought they were just tricks of the moonlight, but then one of them stopped. It stood upright, a humanoid figure made of darkness, its form shifting and flickering like smoke. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The figure didn't answer, but more of them appeared, stepping out from behind gravestones, emerging from the trees. They surrounded me, their forms silent and watchful, and then the whispers stopped. A single voice spoke, deep and resonant, coming from everywhere at once. "You are the keeper now, Andrew." "What does that mean?" I shouted, my fists clenched. "What is this? Why is my name on that stone?" "The cycle must continue. The names are the balance. Without them, there is chaos. The shadows moved closer, their forms stretching toward me. I backed away, but they moved in unison, blocking my escape. "Balance? You're killing people?" I yelled, pointing at the stone. "The stone does not kill. It reveals. The lives are already decided. You are merely the messenger." "No," I said, shaking my head. "I'm not part of this. I didn't ask for this." The shadows stopped, and the voice softened, almost mocking. "Neither did Raymond. But the stone chose him, just as it has chosen you. Deny it, and the price will be your own life." I stared at the stone, the glowing names, the shadowy figures. My head spun as the weight of it all pressed down on me. If what the voice said was true, then my uncle had been trapped here, carrying out this twisted duty, and now it was my turn. "No," I said again, my voice steady this time. "I'm ending this, right now." I ran back to the cabin, slamming the door behind me and grabbing the sledgehammer I'd seen propped against the wall earlier that day. When I returned to the stone, the shadows were still there, waiting silently. "You think you control me?" I shouted, raising the hammer. "Let's see how you work without this thing." As I swung the hammer, the whispers erupted into a deafening roar. The shadows lunged toward me, their forms swirling and merging, but I didn't stop. The hammer connected with the stone, sending cracks spiderwebbing across its surface. The earth trembled beneath my feet, and the air grew colder, the roar of the whispers almost drowning out my thoughts. I swung again and again, each blow breaking off chunks of the stone until it was barely recognizable. For a moment, everything was still. Then the ground beneath me gave way. I screamed as I fell, the world dissolving into darkness. I landed hard, the air knocked out of my lungs, and when I opened my eyes, I wasn't in the cemetery anymore. I was standing in a vast, empty void, the ground beneath me smooth and black, stretching infinitely in all directions. The shadows were there too, surrounding me, their forms now towering and imposing. "You have broken the balance," the voice said, no longer mocking but angry, "and now you will take its place." Before I could react, the shadows surged toward me, their forms merging and twisting until they wrapped around my body. I tried to scream, but no sound came out as the darkness consumed me. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the cemetery, but something was wrong. Everything looked sharper, more vivid. The moon hung unnaturally low in the sky, its light casting long, twisted shadows across the gravestones. The air was colder, heavier, and the silence was absolute. I tried to move, but my body didn't feel right. My arms, my legs, they felt distant, as if they weren't mine anymore. I looked down at my hands and froze. They weren't hands. What I saw was gray, almost translucent, flickering like smoke in the wind. My chest tightened, or at least it would have, if I still had a chest to tighten. I stumbled back, turning toward the stone. The pieces I'd shattered were no longer there. In their place stood the black monolith, whole and gleaming, its surface smooth and perfect. And on it at the very top was my name, Andrew Miller. The whispers returned, soft at first, but they grew louder, layering over one another until they were deafening. They weren't just around me, they were inside me, filling every corner of my mind. "You are the keeper now," the voice said, and this time it came from within me. "No," I shouted, but the word didn't come out the way I'd intended. It echoed, distorted, as if I were speaking from the bottom of a deep well. I tried to run, but my body wouldn't respond. Instead, I moved toward the stone, my legs gliding across the ground as if pulled by an invisible force. The shadows that had once surrounded me were gone, but their presence lingered, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't shake. When I reached the stone, my hand, or whatever my hand had become, lifted on its own. I tried to resist, but it was like trying to stop a flood with a single brick. My fingers brushed the surface of the stone, and new names began to appear. Emily Patterson, John Parker, Sarah Nguyen. I pulled back, horrified, but the damage was already done. The names glowed faintly, their letters sharp and precise, just like before. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This was my role now. I wasn't just connected to the stone, I was part of it. I thought about my uncle, about the journal filled with his desperate words. He'd known what this was, what it meant, but he hadn't warned me. Or maybe he had, and I just hadn't listened. The whispers quieted, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A figure was approaching the cemetery gate, a man hesitant and curious, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. I wanted to scream, to warn him to turn back, but I couldn't. The stone hummed beneath my hand, and I felt its pull, its need. The man walked closer, stepping through the gate. He paused, looking around, and then his eyes landed on me, or what I'd become. I could see the confusion on his face, the way he hesitated as if trying to decide whether to approach or run. "Who's there?" he called, his voice shaky. I tried again to speak, to tell him to leave, but all that came out was a low, guttural whisper. His flashlight swept across the cemetery, landing on the black stone. He froze, his breath hitching as he stepped closer, drawn to it just as I had been. As he reached out to touch the stone, I felt the cycle begin again. It's strange how quiet the house has become. The kind of quiet that presses down on you, heavy and suffocating. I never noticed it when I first moved back here to take care of Mom. I was too focused on the routine. Cleaning, cooking, leaving her meals at the door. She made the rules clear from the beginning. Never come in, never ask questions. "Leave the tray, knock twice and go," she'd said in that sharp, commanding voice of hers. I hated that voice when I was younger, but now, I almost miss hearing it. The house itself doesn't help. It's old, creaky, with walls that feel too close together and windows that barely let in any light. The shadows in the corners seem darker than they should be, even during the day. Mom's room is at the end of the hall upstairs. The door always shut tight. I haven't seen her face in months, maybe longer. She says the light bothers her, that it's easier for her to rest in the dark. Sometimes I wonder if she's even in there. But then she calls for me, her voice muffled but sharp, like an echo from behind thick walls. She's always asking for something. Tea, her medication, more blankets. And I always oblige because what else can I do? She's my mom. The routine was simple at first, manageable. I'd bring her food, knock twice and leave. But lately, things have started to feel off. It began with the sounds. At night, when I'm lying in bed, I hear movement upstairs. Soft footsteps pacing the hallway, stopping just outside my door. I tell myself it's the house settling, or maybe Mom needing to stretch her legs. But the footsteps are too deliberate, too slow. Last night I could have sworn I heard whispering. I stayed in bed, my heart pounding, staring at the ceiling as the sound drifted down the hallway. It was faint, like a low murmur, but I couldn't make out any words. When I asked Mom about it this morning, she brushed me off. "You're imagining things, Laura," she said, her tone clipped. "Focus on what you're supposed to be doing." I didn't argue. Later, when I brought her dinner, I noticed something new. A small envelope tucked just beneath the doorframe. It wasn't there when I dropped off her breakfast. I picked it up, my hands trembling slightly. Inside was a single piece of paper, the edges yellowed and brittle. Written in shaky, uneven handwriting was one word: "Culpa." My stomach dropped. I stared at the note, my mind racing. Was this some kind of message from Mom? A warning? When I knocked on the door, my voice was barely above a whisper. "Mom, did you leave this?" No response. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but the silence stretched on. Finally, I set the tray down and left the note in the same spot I'd found it. Maybe she'd explain tomorrow, I thought. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house felt alive, like it was breathing around me. Every creak of the old wooden floors sent a shiver down my spine, and the faint hum of the wind outside seemed to carry whispers. I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But around midnight, the sound started again. Whispers. This time they weren't faint. They were louder, clearer, like a conversation happening just outside my door. I sat up, straining to hear. The words were muffled, overlapping, but one thing was certain. They were coming from the hallway. "Mom?" I called out, my voice cracking. The whispers stopped. For a moment there was nothing but silence. Then a soft knock came from the wall. Not the door, the wall. My breath caught in my throat. I grabbed the bedside lamp, holding it like a weapon, and crept toward the door. When I opened it, the hallway was empty. The air was cold, colder than it should have been, and I could see my breath fogging in the dim light. I glanced toward Mom's room at the end of the hall. The door was shut, as always, but something about it felt wrong. Then I saw it. Another envelope. It was lying just outside her door, exactly where the first one had been. My hands trembled as I picked it up and opened it. Inside was another piece of yellowed paper, the handwriting shaky and uneven. "You left her." My chest tightened. The words hit harder than I wanted to admit. I shoved the note in my pocket and knocked on Mom's door. "Mom, are you doing this?" Silence. I knocked again, harder this time. "Mom, answer me." Finally, her voice came through, muffled and strained. "Go to bed, Laura." Something about her tone made me hesitate. It wasn't the usual sharpness I was used to. It was softer, almost pleading. "Mom, what's going on?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Go to bed," she repeated, her voice fading. I stood there for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob before finally backing away. Back in my room, I pulled out the 2 notes and stared at them. Culpa. You left her. What were they supposed to mean? And why did they feel so personal? I tried to sleep, but the whispers came back, louder and more insistent. This time I could make out fragments of words. "Why did you leave?" "She needed you." "Your fault." I pressed my hands over my ears, squeezing my eyes shut, but the voices only grew louder. In the morning I felt like a shell of myself. My hands shook as I made breakfast, and my head throbbed from lack of sleep. When I went to take Mom her tray, the door felt heavier, the air around it colder. I knocked twice and left the tray, but as I turned to leave, I noticed something strange. The picture at the end of the hallway had shifted. It was an old family photo, one of the few decorations left in the house. Me, as a child, standing awkwardly next to Mom on the front porch. But now it looked different. Mom's face was the same, stern and unsmiling, but her eyes weren't looking at the camera. They were looking at me, and her expression wasn't just stern, it was accusing. I reached out to touch the frame, and the glass cracked under my fingers. Behind it was another note, tucked into the back of the photo. My stomach churned as I unfolded it. "She never forgave you." My knees buckled, and I sank to the floor, clutching the note in my hands. The whispers were back, faint but growing louder, circling around me like a storm. I looked back at Mom's door, my mind racing. Whatever was going on in that room, I had to find out. I couldn't take it anymore. The whispers, the notes, the cold air pressing against me every time I passed Mom's door. It was all too much. Something was wrong, and no matter how terrified I was, I needed to know the truth. That night the house felt different. The whispers didn't wait until I was in bed this time. They started as soon as the sun set, louder and clearer than ever before. "Laura, why did you leave her?" "She's waiting. She's always waiting." I stood at the bottom of the stairs, staring up at the dark hallway. Mom's door was barely visible, just a shadow at the end of the corridor. The air felt thicker up there, like I was wading through something invisible, but heavy. I held my breath and climbed the stairs. The whispers followed me, growing louder with every step. By the time I reached the top, they were deafening, a cacophony of voices all speaking at once. My name echoed through the hall, overlapping with accusations I couldn't escape. "Laura, why didn't you stay? She needed you." When I reached Mom's door, I froze. The temperature was icy, my breath visible in short, frantic puffs. The door seemed to loom over me, taller than it had ever looked before. I raised my hand to knock, but something stopped me. I heard it, a low rasping sound from the other side. Breathing. My heart pounded as I reached for the doorknob. "Laura, don't." Mom's voice came from behind the door, weak and distant, but it wasn't her usual commanding tone. This was different, pleading. "Go back to your room," she said. "You don't want to see this." Tears burned in my eyes as I gripped the cold metal knob. "Mom, I need to know. I can't keep doing this. Please," she interrupted, her voice breaking. "You'll regret it." But I couldn't stop. With a deep breath, I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The smell hit me first, stale, sour, like rotting wood and something worse. The room was pitch black, the only light coming from the faint glow of the hallway behind me. "Mom?" I whispered, stepping inside. My foot caught on something soft and I stumbled. The room was freezing, the air so thick I could barely breathe. "Laura!" The voice was behind me now, but when I spun around there was no one there. The light from the hallway flickered, then went out completely, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, the flashlight shaking in my trembling hand as I turned it on. The beam swept across the room, and what I saw made my stomach lurch. The walls were covered in photographs, dozens, maybe hundreds, all of them of me. Some were from my childhood, others more recent, but in every single one, Mom was there too, her face twisted into an expression of anger, her eyes glaring at me. I stumbled back, my flashlight catching on something else, a chair in the center of the room. On it sat a figure, slumped and motionless. "Mom?" I approached slowly, my legs shaking so badly I could barely walk. The closer I got, the clearer it became. The figure wasn't moving. When I finally reached the chair, I shone my flashlight directly at her face. It wasn't Mom, at least not anymore. The body was shriveled, almost mummified, her skin gray and stretched tight over her bones. Her mouth hung open, her empty eyes staring at nothing. She'd been dead for years. The room spun around me and I dropped the flashlight, the beam casting wild shadows as it rolled across the floor. "No," I whispered, backing away. "No, no, no." The whispers grew louder, circling me, pressing in from all sides. You left her. She died alone. It's your fault. I fell to my knees, clutching my head as the voices screamed at me. You abandoned her. She waited for you and you never came back. You let her die. The photos on the walls began to change, the images warping and twisting. I saw myself walking out of the house, suitcases in hand, while Mom watched from the window. I saw her in the chair, alone, calling out for me as the room grew darker. Stop! I screamed, but the voices didn't listen. The walls seemed to close in, the photographs coming to life, the faces in them glaring down at me with accusation and hatred. Mom, I'm sorry, I sobbed, curling into a ball on the floor. I'm so sorry. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the whispers stopped. The room fell silent, the air still and suffocating. When I looked up, the chair was empty. But I wasn't alone. Standing in the corner, barely visible in the dim light, was a figure. It was Mom, or at least something that looked like her. Her face was pale and sunken, her eyes glowing faintly as she stared at me. You'll never leave, she said, her voice low and hollow. Not again. I don't remember getting back to my room. One moment, I was on the floor of Mom's, no, the room, staring at that thing in the corner, and the next, I was sitting on my bed, the door locked, clutching my knees to my chest. The whispers were gone, but the silence was worse. It was the kind of silence that felt alive, pressing against my skin, filling my ears with the echo of my own heartbeat. I couldn't stop thinking about the chair, the photographs, the body. How long had she been gone? How had I not known? Because you didn't want to know, the voice in my head whispered, cruel and clear. I tried to convince myself it wasn't real, that I'd imagined it, but the evidence was overwhelming. The notes, the photographs, the shriveled body. It was all there, undeniable. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, the sudden vibration making me jump. When I picked it up, the screen was blank. No missed calls, no texts, just static. And then a voice came through. Laura! I dropped the phone like it burned, watching as it clattered to the floor. The voice wasn't coming from the phone anymore. It was coming from the hallway. I clutched the blanket tighter around me, willing it to stop, but the voice grew louder. Come back, Laura. I squeezed my eyes shut. It's time to finish what you started. Something in me broke. Maybe it was the fear. Maybe it was the guilt. But I couldn't ignore her anymore. I couldn't hide from what I'd done. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The air was colder than before, each breath fogging in front of me. The shadows stretched and shifted, the floor creaking beneath my feet. The door to her room was open now, the light inside flickering like a dying bulb. I walked toward it, my legs shaking with every step. When I crossed the threshold, the room was different. The photographs were gone, the chair empty, but the walls seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The air was thick, suffocating, and the faint smell of decay lingered. In the center of the room stood a mirror, tall, ancient, with an ornate, cracked frame. I didn't remember it being there before, but it felt familiar, like it had always been waiting for me. As I approached, my reflection stared back, pale and hollow-eyed, but something was wrong. My reflection wasn't moving with me. It stood still, watching, its lips curling into a bitter smile. Do you see now? The reflection said, its voice layered with Mom's. You can't escape. You never could. I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. I didn't mean to leave. I didn't know. You left her. The reflection interrupted. She begged you to stay, and you left. You killed her. No! I screamed, slamming my hands against the glass. The reflection twisted, warping into Mom's face. Her hollow cheeks, her sunken eyes, her accusing stare. You abandoned me, Laura. Now it's your turn to stay. The glass cracked beneath my hands, and the world around me began to spin. The walls of the room blurred, the floor disappearing beneath my feet. I was falling, spiraling into darkness, with her voice echoing in my ears. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the chair. The room was silent again, but this time I wasn't alone. The walls were covered with photographs once more, but now they were different. They showed me sitting in the chair, staring blankly at the door. They showed shadows moving in the hallway, the outline of a figure standing just out of reach. The door creaked open, and for a moment, I thought I saw myself in the hallway. A younger version, carrying a tray of food, looking hesitant, but she vanished before I could call out. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't respond. The whispers returned, soft at first, then louder, filling the room with accusations and regrets. And then I realized they weren't coming from the walls anymore. They were coming from me.